Welcome. My name is Master Robert Liedke. I'm going to introduce you to Aikido, self-defense. These techniques have been simplified, modified for street use, and will cover every practical self-defense situation you may encounter. Practice them carefully, and one day they may save your life. Thank you. The Shianagi technique is the first technique taught in this system. By keeping your elbow close to your body and assuming a natural stance, you will grasp the wrist of the partner, step across, break free of his grasp at this point. Pivot your knee downward, raise the arm over your head and draw him directly down. At this point, you can keep him pinned by twisting on his wrist. Let's watch this technique again. Very important is the keeping the arm close to the body and stepping with the body as a unit. This will overcome any resistance in your opponent or your partner. Then pivot, breaking free, pivot to your left knee, raise the arm over your head, and then straight down, moving in and locking your opponent in a pin. This is a very strong defense against a wrist grab. This is a very strong defense against a wrist grab. Once you have your opponent in this position, this can become a very painful wrist lock and pin. What you do is rotate the wrist inward and downward. You then shift your right knee forward to lock your opponent into a painful pin. This next technique is done from a wrist grab. It is the Aikido technique. Again, you will keep your elbow close to your body. You will then move downward against his resistance, rotate upward, twist your wrist in your opponent's grasp, and grab. With your right hand, you will push up and across his face with his elbow, breaking his balance, then quickly pivoting around to your left. You will pin your opponent in a painful wrist lock. Once your opponent has grabbed your wrist and you have rotated him into this position, very important is to push this elbow up across his face. This breaks your opponent's balance. Then with a pivot of your left foot behind you, destroy your opponent's balance, pivot again into a very painful wrist lock. At this point, when you pin your opponent, you can keep him securely pinned by grasping his fingers and holding at the juncture of his wrist and hand. Stepping with your right foot in near his armpit, you allow his arm to bend slightly. Now twisting the fingers and the wrist at the same time produces a tremendous amount of pain and will keep all the force focused on his shoulder. The next technique in this series is the Liedke technique. This is one of the most powerful pain producers in the entire Aikido repertoire. When the wrist is bent into this direction with the elbow up, it locks a circuit of energy right here at this joint. By twisting, you cause so much pain that the knees buckle. Throw your opponent down. Step into a painful pin. An important factor in this technique, again, is keeping your elbow close to your body. Once you draw down and rotate upward, you twist your wrist in his grasp into this position. Once you have the elbow up and the hand twisted in this position, you need only to twist in opposite directions. This causes immediate pain. Then lead your subject to the ground. Slide your hand out, grasp his fingers, apply your thumb to the back of his wrist. Lean forward. This becomes extremely painful. A very effective pin. The next technique in this series is the Sankyo technique. When your wrist is grasped by your opponent, again, keep your elbow close to your body. This time, you will step out with your left foot, raise the arm into this position, up over your shoulder, and to the forwards. This position is very important. First of all, you have his wrist twisted in a very, very painful position. You also grasp his fingers and twist, and then quickly take him down, step in, and again pin. Now this pin forces all of the weight onto his shoulder so that he cannot rise. And it is also very painful. When your opponent grabs your wrist, again, remember to keep your elbow close to your body. Notice how my arm and hand have curved. When I step through and grasp his wrist, I'm actually pulling him into a state of imbalance. At this point, I break free and grasp with two hands. This is a very painful position. My thumb is on the back of his thumb, and my fingers are grasping all four of his fingers. I will then quickly move to the forward, take him down, pivot, and into this standing pin. When you're in this position for the pin, you must keep your balance. Your knees must be bent, your back straight, and moving your right knee forward and applying pressure against the back of his hand with your thumb and twisting his fingers at the same time produces a very powerful pin. Centers all the weight on his shoulders so he cannot rise. When your partner or opponent grasps your wrist in this fashion, again, keeping your elbow close into your body, you will rotate your arm upward. At this point, you will grab his wrist at this juncture, holding him firmly with these fingers. This extended finger here is very important. Do not bend this finger at all. When you turn to the side, what happens is this muscle here lifts up, and underneath the muscle is a very painful nerve center. The root of your finger is what applies the pain here. Not bending or twisting this finger, but keeping it perfectly straight. Once you lead your partner up and then down into a painful pin, at this point, when you rotate your arm upward, you will grasp your opponent's wrist at the juncture of his hand and wrist. You will then pull away and free your other hand. It is very important that you keep this finger straight. The next move is to turn your body to the side. This applies pressure with the root of your forefinger against a cluster of nerves underneath the muscle in his wrist. You will then lead your partner painfully downward, grasp his hand, his fingers, twist, apply your other hand and thumb to the back of his thumb and into a very painful pin. When your opponent grabs you by the shoulder, you will grasp his hand, putting your fingers inside his hand, turning his wrist over with your shoulder movement. You will then take your arm, pull him into your body, place your left hand on the joint of his elbow to keep it locked. You will then slide your left foot forward, dropping your opponent to the ground. You will now raise up, keeping his arms straight and applying pressure downward on his fingers. Very painful lock, and one which no one will escape from. When your opponent grasps you by the shoulder, you'll reach over with your right hand, placing it over his hand and inside his palm with your fingers. You will then turn your shoulder, holding his hand close to your body. Roll your shoulder over into this position. Pull him into you with your left hand. Keep his elbow locked. Then slide your left foot out and drop your opponent down. In this position, raise up. Very, very painful and powerful lock. When your opponent grasps your wrist, generally what will happen is that he will pull you forward slightly. You will move forward with your opponent's pull, turning your hand so the palm is upright, pushing it beyond where he intended to pull you up into the crook of his elbow. At this point, you will then put your hand behind his neck, turn your body, drop to your knee and apply pressure on the back of his neck and push upward against the crook of his elbow. This will throw him end over end. Watch again. Moving inward into the crook of his elbow. Pivoting my body and placing my hand behind his neck. I will push down on his neck, up into the crook of his elbow, and I will drop my body weight to throw him. Very powerful throwing technique. The next technique in the series is the kokyo-nage. Again, we will demonstrate this from a wrist grab. You will lead your opponent grasp downward, rotating upward, rotating your hand in his grasp, grabbing with these fingers. You will then step forward with your left foot to slightly behind your opponent. You will then bring your opponent's head right to your chest. At this point, you need only to lift his chin to throw him. Again, drawing down, rotating upward, grasping your opponent's wrist, stepping with your left foot around behind him, bringing his head into your body, lifting his chin and stepping through. Will throw your opponent. When your opponent grasps your wrist, again, keeping your elbow in close to your body, rotating it upward, and grasping your opponent's wrist. You will then step in to this position, bringing your opponent's arm across your body and locking him into a position of imbalance. You need only to stick your arm out and point your finger and extend your energy and throw your opponent. When your opponent grasps your wrist, you keep your elbow into your body, rotate upward, grasp his wrist. With your left foot, you will step inside and pivot so you're alongside your opponent. You will keep his arm across your body and locked. You need only to point your finger. Keep your arm very straight and stiff, and using your left foot, step forward and throw your opponent with the power of your shoulder. When your opponent grasps you by the wrist, this position, step back. Turn your wrist slightly in his. Grasp his wrist with these fingers. Lead your opponent forward so that all of his weight rests on his forward foot. Then make a rotating motion and throw your opponent. Pull him into you and over onto his chest. Open his hand and apply a very painful pin. This is a very painful, immobilizing position. Your opponent cannot rise, and you can keep him pinned here. The next technique in this series is the Koshionagi technique. Again, you will begin by keeping your elbow close to your body and rotating his hand and arm upward. At this point, you will then step in front of your opponent, holding on to his wrist. What you will actually be doing is holding him upward into a state of imbalance. You will then quickly drop and cut his legs out from underneath him as you throw him. Then quickly turn over into a pin, very painful pin, and immobilize him. This next technique in the series, you will be able to immobilize your opponent and choke him unconscious if necessary. Again, you keep your elbow close to your body, using your body as a unit. Rotate him into this position. You'll now step with your left foot slightly to the side and behind your opponent, pulling him forward as you do. You now have your left hand underneath his chin. You will take one step back with your right foot and then a step with your left and drop your opponent into a painful choking position. You can finish off the choke simply by squeezing and leaning in, easily choking him unconscious. When your opponent grasps your wrist, again, remember to keep your elbow in close to your body, using your body as a unit as you rotate your partner's arm. At this point, grasp, step with your left foot to the side and slightly behind your opponent and pull his arm forward as you do so. This places you into this position. You now have your left hand under his chin. Keep your hand straight. Step back with your right foot, one step, and then your left, one step, and drop down. You now have him in a position where you are balanced, and you can easily choke him unconscious by leaning inward, applying pressure against his neck. Very painful and immobilizing technique. With assaults becoming more and more common on the street, self-defense from a punch or punches will now be demonstrated. As your opponent steps forward to throw a punch, you will block and strike to the neck to distract him. Then grasping the wrist, you will lead the hand downward, the wrist into your other hand, step through, raise the hand over your head and straight down, locking your opponent in a painful. The grip on the wrist is very important. You must have both hands at the juncture of the hand and wrist. When a pressure is applied, it should be applied in upward circular manner towards your stomach with his fingers pointing upward. And then simply lift up and intense pain will occur to your attacker. Notice how my knee keeps my opponent pinned while I apply pain. He cannot escape. There is tremendous pain, and I have him locked in here tightly with my knee. Continuing with the same technique, one of the important factors is to evade the punch through a circular motion. What you would be doing is, as your opponent punches, this circular striking and blocking will, first, this is going to distract your opponent. This is not meant to kill, but merely to distract. The punches, they're blocked here by your wrist. You then immediately grab, bring the arm down, pass it into the other hand, step through, over your head, and straight downward with as much force as you can muster. This painful pin will keep your opponent subjugated. In a street situation, speed of the attack, I will now demonstrate the Shionagi technique. This next technique, Ikkyo technique in this series, will be demonstrated from a punch. As your opponent steps forward and punches, you will block by pushing up his arm at the elbow, push it up and across his face, at the same time pivoting and straightening out the arm, stepping in and locking your opponent in a painful pin. You must be balanced. Must maintain your balance, and by bending your knee and leaning slightly forward, you keep his shoulder forced to the surface in a very painful pin. As your opponent steps forward to punch, you step slightly to the side to evade the punch, pushing his elbow upward towards his face. Stepping back and pivoting will take your opponent down, and at this time, step in with your foot very close to your opponent's armpit. You will then apply pressure using your fingers to hold his thumb, again, on the back of his thumb. Lean forward slightly, and it is a very painful pin which will keep your opponent subjugated, unable to move. Another variation of the Ikkyo technique can be used as a come-along in a particularly crowded place, a bar or such. When your opponent punches, you block his punch, again, upward, cross his face, pivot your body. As you begin to lower his elbow, place his hand in the crook of your elbow. Cut downward, place your other hand up under his chin. Bring his chin up at the same time you cut down on his elbow inside. This is a very painful come-along, and you can take anybody anywhere with this technique, completely subjugated. You can call the police, whatever you need to do. And at this position, you can drop into a very painful pin. Notice I continue to keep my hand in the crook of his elbow, using my forearm as leverage to cause intense pain to my opponent. He cannot escape. The next technique in the punching series is the Nikyo technique. As my opponent throws a punch, I will step to the side to evade the punch, grasping his hand at the juncture of his wrist and hand. I will then turn the hand over into this position. This position is very important. I will then apply downward pressure here at the juncture of the joint, causing his knees to buckle. As I push him away, I can slap him to the forehead and kick him to the chest. Watch again this punching technique of Nikyo. Notice that I've stepped back, maintaining my balance, and have my opponent in an off-balance position. At this moment, bending his arm in will be quite easy, having lost all its power. I can then twist, making his knees buckle, slap him to the forehead, and kick him to the chest. This next technique demonstrated from a punch will be a complete revolution of the body. As your opponent steps forward to punch, you evade the punch, blocking and placing your hand behind his head at the neck. You will then grasp, extend slightly forward so your opponent's weight is on his front foot. You will then direct his arm downward and make a circular motion with the hand on the neck to rotate him into a complete throw. Then you can lock him into a very painful pin. Notice that his arm is straight, his elbow is locked, and I have tremendous pressure on the back of his hand to keep him subjugated. This next technique in the punching series is the kokyo-nagi. This is quite a complicated technique, so I will perform it and explain it very slowly. As your opponent steps forward to punch, you will step to the side to evade his punch. As you evade his punch, you will begin to lead it downward, grasping his wrist at this point. As you lead him downward, your other hand will come around and bring his head close to your shoulder as you step back with your right foot. This puts him into this position. At this point, you will simply lift your right hand under his chin and step away. His momentum will throw him down quite hard. This next self-defense technique will be done from a hair grab. When your opponent grasps you by the hair, place your thumb upon the back of his hand, force your fingers into his palm. Reach up with your other hand as you begin to break free. Force your opponent downward. At this point, you will then step across your opponent to this position and kneel on his throat and twist his wrist in this direction. It's a very painful, effective lock. Notice how his arm is secured here, and I am leaving my full weight on his throat. He is completely subjugated. This next self-defense technique will be done from a front hair grab. As he grabs you by the hair in front, place one hand on the joint between his wrist and hand. Place your other hand over it. Step back with your right foot, bend forward, forcing your opponent downward, and then step back with your left. At this position, roll the hand into a painful lock. This next self-defense technique will be done from a rear hair grab. As your opponent grasps you from the rear, you will take a step back, place your right hand upon his, step back with your left foot, keep turning your body, break free, step under again with your right and turn your body to the forward. At this point, throw your opponent. Reviewing this technique, when your opponent grasps you from the back of the hair, you will step back with your right foot, reach up, place your hand on his hand, guide your thumb underneath as you do this, step back with your left foot, begin to turn your body into this position, breaking free, coming up and under to this position. You have him now in a painful grip, raised up into unbalance, and throw him by lifting his leg. Common street attack is the tackle. And to avoid it, I'll show you two methods. Jim? As he reaches in and grabs me around the legs, I proceed to move backward with his forward momentum, grasping him by the hair. If the person happens to be bald, I'm following up with my hand under his chin. This again puts pressure on the back of his neck, and I'm able to force him away from me. At this position, I can deliver a kick to his groin to finish him off, if necessary. Now watch this at realistic speed. Second method against this street fighting assault of tackle is to have the awareness and alertness to prevent it from happening to begin with. As your attacker moves in, you move backward and quickly force them down with your hands on the back of their head. We'll do this at a faster speed. I'd like to demonstrate some of the techniques that I teach to correctional officers for use in their field. For instance, if the subject is against the wall and does not want to move away, and you go to reach for him, and he pushes your hand away, and both hands are up to keep you away, a simple method is to push against this hand, then quickly push the elbow up. At this position, right here, at this position, across his face will force him directly into the wall. Now you need only at this position to raise his arm, lower your body, so that his hand is in the crook of your elbow. Now watch what happens when I cut down. His chin comes right into me, and he's in a perfect come along and hold, and I can take him anywhere. This next technique I'd like to demonstrate. The subject is up against the wall, has arms crossed and locked in their chest so you cannot grab one of their hands. The thing to do in this case is quickly reach up behind the head, put your heel of your hand up against their nose. Now instead of pushing just straight up, push slightly up and to the side, turning his head and completely around and taking the person down. You can keep them in this fashion, pinned and in pain if they move around too much. This controlling technique requires only that you grab the opposite hand in this fashion. Now, if you see here, I'm holding his 4 fingers. Now, what I do in this case now is as I begin downward pressure on his wrist joint here, I will then turn upward in this position. Quickly stepping underneath, keeping the same pain, I will lead him right back into a choke and a come-along. I'll now apply this technique in a more realistic fashion. Thank you for watching my videotape on Aikido self-defense. I hope it has given you great insight on how to escape from most self-defense situations unharmed. Please practice the techniques carefully and diligently, and they will serve you well. Thank you.